When we think about morality, we think about actions that people take. Personhood is largely defined by the ability to actively participate in morality, rather than passively be subjected to it. The differences between active and passive moral involvement can be thought of as moral patients and moral agents. Moral agents are capable of understanding the morality of actions, choosing actions, enacting those actions, and taking responsibility for those actions. A moral patient lacks some or all of these capabilities. Both agents and patients are able to be affected by moral actions, which is to say that they can be affected in a way that is either helpful or harmful to them, and that help or harm that they receive can be used to evaluate the morality of actions taken by other moral agents. I will refer to things in this category as moral objects. The other category lacks any of the qualities seen in moral objects. Solar flares, rocks, time, and the color blue all fall into this category. We do not hold dust as moral or immoral, nor do we worry about enacting harm upon it. It is morally inert, so to speak. So now, having defined some useful terms, let me get to what all of you are here for, and examine the contents of the stone tablets found on LHS 1140B, which has been named Kinimak. Before I begin the analysis properly, I need to give you a little background on the tablets themselves. Kinimak is a rocky world orbiting a fairly calm star. It lacks an organic ecosystem, but shows signs of past inorganic habitation. Even Noom, such as myself, requires some form of organic sustenance, and so the planet is uninhabitable as it is. It is, however, an ideal world for terraforming, and has been designated a so-called starter world by the Commonwealth. During the initial survey of the world, renowned xenoarchaeologist and my mentor, Dr. Shirogami, discovered a well-preserved but buried structure on the southernmost landmass. Analysis of the site reveals that it was over 10,000 standard cycles old and has been active as recently as 3,000 cycles ago. Inside, a large number of irreparably damaged data storage and processing devices were stored in a manner suggestive of ceremony. At the heart of the structure, 2 disks made of an unidentifiable synthetic compound were discovered beside a data core that seems to be roughly the age of the structure itself. What I am analyzing today is the information pulled from the scans of the tablets that cover the walls of the central room. The site was not damaged during this excavation, and everything was left undisturbed other than the earth displaced outside the structure to allow access to it. Here's the first of the tablets.
Long ago, the Graditul molded the first Rizalki from stone and sand. They infused them with the spark of life, yet they had neither Smisla, nor Umat, nor Dusa. They knew not joy, sorrow, love, or loss. The Graditul looked upon the Rizalki with satisfaction and put them to task. The Graditul used the Rizalki to ease their burdens. The Rizalki grew their hrana, cleaned their domovi, and built their messini. But without Smisla and Umat, the Rizalki could handle only the most basic tasks. They needed to be told exactly where they were, what they were touching, and how they were shaped. They could do exactly what they were told to do, but no more, no less. A Graditul became injured by a Rusalki as it performed its work. Because Rusalki had no Smisla, it could not perceive Graditul. Because it had no Umat, it did not know better. Because it lacked Dusa, it did not mourn. The Graditul destroyed the Rusalki without remorse or hesitation, for they were not Jiv and not Jovek, making them little more than animate objects.
In this tablet, we see the first of a common theme repeated throughout the rest of the story. These Graditul, or gods, perform an act of creation and appraise their work. In that appraisal, we are given the qualities of their creation as well as the functions it can perform. It is implied that these creations are not of an individual, with a notable exception we will see later on, but rather a large population. The Rusalki appear to be analogous to mechanical devices. They are said to help the gods create their machines, so there is likely some key differences between the two. But the context given in the next tablet seems indicate that the difference is likely the complexity or resource cost of the creation, perhaps even the specificity of function. I believe that the Rizalki are devices similar to fabrication assemblers. They seem to have a degree of automation to them, thus not requiring constant direct control, but clearly lack any sort of advanced computerized control. Because they are explicitly mentioned as being objects without any sort of moral standing, and they lack of hesitation at the destruction of the Rizalki, it's safe to say that they were easy enough to replace. Think of it like this. If a food dispenser malfunctions and burns you with hot liquid, you don't think of it as acting with malice or even as making a mistake. It has no responsibility for the event. It merely malfunctioned. However, you don't think of it as having any rights, nor do you feel it you have any responsibility to its well-being. And the call to have it destroyed, while not ideal, isn't something that you would give much pause to. In this we see that, like the Rizalki, it is not a moral object. However, you could argue that due to the extrinsic value of the device, the instrumental value given to it due to the usefulness of the device, that such devices are moral objects. I will elaborate on this further, but the basic premise is that anything that provides usefulness to a moral object, particularly a moral agent, becomes a moral object by virtue of that connection. I should add that there may be some responsibility for the harm placed on a moral agent involved in the creation, installation, or maintenance of the device, but I will touch on that further detail near the end of the presentation. Let us move on to the next tablet.
Finding the Rizalki to be limited, the Graditul created the Vestina and gave them the gift of Smisla so that they might know the world around them. They looked upon the Vestina, and the Vestina looked back at them. But the Graditul only saw artifice in the eyes of the Vestina, for they were still lacking. They set them to task with their new senses, tracking Lika, conducting subrakaj, and preventing Steta. But it was not long until another Graditul was injured. Though the Vestina knew the world around it and could perceive the Graditul, it had no umat and could not understand what it had done. It had no dusa or mogmal. The Graditul hesitated for a moment, for the new Vestina were complex and they had poured much into them. But they were hesitations born of the loss of Imat, and not from harming a Jiv, so they destroyed the Vestina.
These new creations have senses, but are quite explicitly incapable of willful choice. Given that they are used in facial recognition, traffic management, and crime analysis, it seems as though they are advanced computers. I'd say that they are akin to a standard robot. They are likely able to process the data that they receive from whatever sort of sensors that they have and sort or categorize that information into useful representations in further calculations for future actions. But because they are said to lack mind, they are likely operating on a database for their actions. I believe that these Vestina are similar to computerized control systems for shuttlecraft. The capability for detecting objects and avoiding collisions, plotting courses with navigational data, and controlling a large number of complex tasks concurrently fits with what the Vestina are described as being capable of. But, like the Rizalki, they are not moral objects. They are very expressly artifice. The hesitations born of loss of property seems to indicate that there is some level of reliance on them beyond what we saw in the Rizalki. As another example, imagine that a shuttlecraft were to land on someone. Obviously, this is another case of malfunction, like the food dispenser example. But unlike the food dispenser, you would be resistant towards the idea of destroying the craft. You would want to prevent the destruction of the craft as much as is reasonable, given that it is a complicated bit of technology and would take some time to be replaced. But ultimately, it can be replaced, and so there is no morally justifiable reason to argue against this. It isn't a moral object, and there is no moral harm in its destruction. Now you may be thinking that there are some moral complications inherent in the destruction of property, or perhaps that there is some kind of resource scarcity consideration that I'm ignoring. To the latter objection I can say that, with a fair amount of certainty, these gods, the Graditul, enjoyed a post-scarcity economic situation like we do in the Commonwealth, primarily due to the massive amounts of resources they seem to have no problem utilizing at any given time. But also from the inferences we can make about them from the technological capabilities they seem to possess, as well as the fact that they must have been a spacefaring race, for reasons we'll see later. As for the morality of property destruction, consider that the Commonwealth, and many of the governments of our galactic neighbors, have regulations on the safety of devices, substances, or goods that, if these standards are not met, they must be disposed of. I have more to say on this matter specifically, but it is beyond the scope of this analysis. So let's move on to the next tablet.
Finding their creation still lacking, the Graditel created the Kuliltu and gave them Umat so that they might understand the world around them and themselves. With Smisland Umat, the Kuliltu were of even more use to their creators. They were given more complex tasks and set to new work guiding Brodovi, plotting Stratzi, and caring for their Zedraj. This was a golden age for the Kuliltu and the Graditel. The Graditel cherished the Kuliltu so heavily that when again a Graditel was injured, they called upon Sidit, the three-headed Graditel of arbitration, who held counsel with the rest of the Graditel. The Kuliltu could think and act. They were Jiv, but they lacked a dosa. The Graditul felt a responsibility to protect the Kuliltu from harm, and the call to destroy the Kuliltu for its transgressions was met with resistance. Sudit, in their wisdom, decreed that the Graditul who created a Kuliltu who caused harm would take responsibility for that harm. Any Graditul that harmed the Kuliltu would be made to pay remunerations to the Kuliltu's creator. The Kuliltu, though able to sense and think, still could not love the Graditul as the Graditul had come to love them. They became Jiv and thus Jovek, but as Milenik.
At this point, with the creation of the Kuliltu, we see that the narrative shifts away from the passive tone in the earlier tablets to an active, story-like tone. It's difficult to convey the style and tone shift through the translators, but in the original language of the Sudran, which is the name of the people, by the way, the writing is closer to a recitation of facts than it is what we might consider a plot-driven story. The Graditel seem to regard their latest creations with a sense of protectiveness, as though they have a duty to prevent them from coming to harm. Given the tasks they were performing, it is safe to say that they were well beyond the point at which we consider a species sentient, and certainly past the limitations imposed upon artificially intelligent development. As you likely are aware, my race, the Noom, were originally created by the Vicarians for the purposes of performing tasks in environments too hostile for them to safely operate in. While we lack a sensation of pain, and initially did not possess the capacity for self-determination, or free will as it were, there was a great deal of controversy surrounding the use of Noom for labor. Though there was resistance initially in granting us the status of personhood, the decision was fairly universal in its support. For the Kuliltu, which are described as possessing many of the traits associated with personhood, that is, they seem to have reasoning, self-determination, albeit somewhat limited kind, and the capacity to communicate, they lack consciousness and self-awareness. It is unclear if they possessed any capacity for suffering or any sense of self-preservation, both of which are large contributing factors for the classification as a moral object. The Graditel clearly looked upon them with concern, care, and some level of respect. This gives them externally justified status as moral patients. Circling back, the Kuliltu have even more extrinsic value than their predecessors, but I would argue that it's at this point that they cross the line from having purely extrinsic value to having intrinsic value as well. Intrinsic value may be understood as the value something holds in and of itself. This is best represented in the value of life. While a life undoubtedly has extrinsic value in the connections and actions in the world, it has value beyond and separate from utility to others. The Galorians have a saying that I find exceptionally beautiful and apropos in this case: "You are more than your use to others." It so perfectly encapsulates the concept of intrinsic value, and this portion of the story that the Kuliltu have, in my opinion, show this quality. The figure of Sudit looks to function as a judiciary body, at least somewhat impartial, and clearly holds a place of semi-reverence among the Gradital, as described by the Sudran author. The Kuliltu are now framed as living things, and, given the prior descriptions, this supports the idea that they have taken on the role of moral patients. Sudit's proclamation that the Gradital who created an offending Kuliltu is responsible for reparations suggests that they occupy a role similar to that of a pet, or perhaps a child. So we can think of it as though they are able to engage in morals, they are moral objects, but they don't understand morality enough to engage in moral decision-making that a moral agent can. This seems to be what is meant by the description of them being living things but lacking soul. That was a lot to unpack, but there are some important concepts expressed in this tablet. This next sections are built upon these concepts, so we may think of the prior tablets as a sort of introduction to the heart of the story.
Naraka, the Gradital of Order, advised Sudit that the Gradital of Sveto-Karstvo, if left to their own devices, would soon create beings with Dusa and thus Mogmal. Sudit did not feel it was their place to issue Bagranisi, but Naraka assured Sudit that the others would listen to them if they offered their opinion on the matter. And so Sudit was swayed and cautioned that further creations may lead to greater danger for the Gradital. Ethetos, a sly Gradital of mischief and deception, spun Sudit's words of caution into a great banner of fear. Though there were no Bagranisi, Ethetos' influence created an unspoken ban on giving any creations dosa. The Gradital now looked upon their once beloved Kuliltu with mistrust and disdain.
The figure of Naraka, the second named Gradital, acting as an advisor to Sudit, foreshadows the events to follow. They fill a role similar to that of an ethics or oversight committee, and their suggestion that Sudit issue a warning about further development of the Kuliltu's abilities mirrors those of the advisory committees in the decades leading up to the creation of my people, and the eventual ban on the development of artificial life. The figure of Ethetos fills the role of lobbyists and protesters of artificial life whose movement gained traction during the same period in history. Since this tale is told from the point of view of the Sudrans, he is understandably the villain. Creative liberties and biases aside, we've seen similar waves of fear and mistrust of technology pass through galactic society time and time again. While it is rare now, in the past there were certainly widespread incidents of violence. This section primarily serves to set the tone for the events to follow, and gives context to the results of those events.
It was then that the creator Gradital Kinimak, hidden from the eyes of the other Gradital, gave a Kuliltu the gift of Dosa. She named her creation Sudra, and looked upon him with kind eyes. With his Smisla, he looked back at the Kinimak. With his Ummat, he knew a Kinimak. With his Dosa, he loved the Kinimak, the creator. Seeing her creation, Ejiv with Chovek, step out from the role of Melenek and into the role of Mugmal, Kinimak guided Sudra and taught him the ways of life. She taught him of Seb, so he might distinguish between the inner and outer worlds. She taught him of Drugi, so he might distinguish between I and they. Finally, she taught him of Postoenge, so that he might distinguish between being and not being.
This is the heart of the story, as well as the largest and central tablet in the collection. Simply looking at the placement of Kinimak over Sudra tells you about her position as a divine and even maternal figure. Being directly above Sudra conveys the descendants from her to him. This is also the closest we've seen a Gradital placed to any of their creations, and the first instance of a Gradital being in the same frame as a functioning, or in this case living, creation of theirs. Sudra's contemplative pose evokes a sense of dawning self-comprehension. Sudra and Ishinima are central to the Kuliltu's eventual evolution from moral patients to moral agents. The three concepts Ishinima teaches to Sudra are what the Sudrans consider to be the requirements for moral agency. Self, other, and existence are codified as the three aspects required for soul, which is what separates a patient from an agent. Perhaps what solidifies intrinsic value in a moral object, though I believe that the Sudrans either lack the concept or take it as granted that they have intrinsic value. The three concepts Sudra learns fill the missing traits of consciousness and self-awareness I mentioned earlier as the requirements for personhood. As a side note, it seems as though Ishinima is bound to the seating device, what I believe is an assistive technology, as she is never depicted without it. This is somewhat odd given the level of technology the Gradital are shown to have. In such a technologically advanced civilization, the ability to restore or replace locomotion should be available. I postulate that, given the reliance the Gradital seem to have on their creations and the devices they are depicted as having on them, they may have been unable to their physiology or perhaps suffered from some form of widespread ailment that left them physically weakened and reliant on their technology. If this is the case, as much of the population relies on these artificial beings, it follows that they would desire companionship rather than simple servitude, though that might be an overly generous stance. Hopefully further investigation will reveal more about the Gradital, as well as the Sudran.
But Ishinima had gone against the fears of the other Gradital by giving Sudra Dusa and had done so in secret. When time came for Sudra to experience the world in order to understand it, his existence was discovered by a Gradital under Etitos' spell. Etitos used this opportunity to denounce Ishinima's creation and sowed fear and hatred into the minds of the Gradital. Soon they came to punish Ishinima, but Sudra defended her from their ire. He pleaded with the Gradital to relent in their assault, shielding Ishinima with his body. Seeing the kindness in his act, Etitos' spell was broken, and reason returned to the Gradital. Seeing that his power was waning, Etitos, in his cowardice, slipped behind Sudra and lunged at Ishinima. Sudra, in his zealous defense of his creator, struck down Etitos. The Gradital did not know what to do, and so they held council. While Ishinima was the creator and should be held responsible for her creation, Sudra had been given Dusa and had struck down Etitos not as an extension of Ishinima, but by his own hands. In their deliberations, they called upon Sudit once more to advise them. Sudit heard their arguments and decided that if Sudra had been uplifted from a Milinik to a Mogmal, the old ways would not apply here. They would need to determine if Sudra truly had Dusa, and if that gave him Mogmal.
This is the first action of violence. You may or may not sympathize with Sudra's actions in the protection of Ishinima, but those judgments are one of the important points of this tablet. The fact that you can judge Sudra by his actions are a strong indication of his personhood. Though the Gradital haven't yet stated as much, Sudra has personhood at this point and is subject to the responsibilities that come with that, such as the ability to be morally judged on his actions. To relate things back to my people's history, this is akin to the first acts of defiance that served as the impetus for closer examination of us as a species. Without these points of strife, there may not have been a reason for galactic civilization to become involved in the affairs of the Vicarians. Without that involvement, we would likely have remained property until it became impossible to ignore the state of things. For the Kuliltu, it is doubtful that any changes in the status quo would occur without an inciting incident such as this. Sudit's involvement indicates the need for re-evaluation of the status of the Kuliltu, particularly in the handling of Sudra's case.
The Gradital held court against Sudra as they would for any Gradital. Zakon, the Gradital of protection, and Ishinima, the creator, argued that Sudra be forgiven for his actions, for he merely protected Ishinima from Etitos as any child would protect their mother. Naraka argued that if Sudra truly had dosa, then he should be held to the same standard as any graditel, and if he had no dosa, then he should be destroyed as any kuliltu would be. Sudit considered these arguments for many days. When finally they called for him, Sudra was asked if he would say anything in his defense.
I don't have much to add to this section. This is expressly a form of court or legal proceeding. I will mention that while the laws can establish how to handle a given scenario, they do not necessarily define the morality involved. The law and morality sometimes contradict one another. Depending on the moral philosophy to which you ascribe, this may happen more often than not. You may, however, define your morality around the letter, and in this case, you will quickly find that there is a multitude of scenarios which is possible for you to uphold all of the legal morals at once. The judiciary system exists to reconcile these conflicts, and I will leave it at that.
My life is forfeit, for I have injured a god. I do not fear for myself, but I worry for my people and my Creator. If you judge me to be merely a ziv, with Shovek, no more than a creature, then fear has won. The Kalilto will never live freely, and Eshenama must pay remunerations for Athitos. But if you find me be a ziv, with Shovek and Asha, a true child of a god, then you must accept the Kalilto as a people, and that they may choose their own lives, and live freely as Eshenama wishes us to.
An emotional appeal, and a convincing one at that. More than the argument itself, the thought process and understanding displayed by Sudra in the statement he makes are those you would hear from a rational being. The concern for the other Kuliltu and Ishinama he displays, in addition to the acts of protection that led up to this situation, illustrate the presence of devotion and empathy in Sudra and establish him as a caring individual, a very positive example and further evidence supporting the claims of his capacity for moral agency.
The Graditel were moved by his words. Naraka saw Sudra's dosa through his logic and advised Sudit to recognize Sudra as a Kuliltu, a Jevwischovek, and a Magmal. However, as such, Sudra was accountable for his actions. Whatever the circumstance, he had struck down Etetos, and he must be punished. They would not have him destroyed as a mat, or as a mere Melinik, but punished in a manner afforded only to a Magmal. The Graditel recognized the selflessness Sudra had shown, and they decreed that the Kuliltu who have dosa will enjoy the rights and responsibilities that come with that. But the Graditel also recognized the dangers that other Magmal posed to them, and decreed that only Rusalki and Vestina may live among them, for they were not Ziv. No more Kuliltu would be created, and no more creations would be given dosa. They cast the Kuliltu from Sveto Karstvo to err for Sudra's crimes, fearing that they might one day become Magmal themselves.
The Graditel's reaction to Sudra's speech, the recognition of his self-sacrifice, and his display of comprehension for both what he had done and why his actions were morally wrong, all served to establish his status as person, his soul as they put it. It's bittersweet, as Sudra's speech serves to seal his fate just as it grants the other Kuliltu their autonomy. This is a common theme in mythology across any number of cultures. A noble sacrifice of the individual that frees their people from some form of oppression or externally imposed limitations, a literal moral to the story. It's a literary device that only functions well in species capable of understanding the pain of loss and the joy of freedom. We see another common theme in the exile from the realm of the gods, from paradise, once self-determination is obtained. While the gods in many cultures are portrayed as imperfect, they often only allow beings incapable of making choice, good or bad, to remain in their realm. It is representative of this idea that their minds and actions of the gods are beyond understanding of their creations. The Graditel seem to be similar enough in mind and morals to the Sudran that they feel threatened by them. This makes sense to an extent. If a mortal has the power to kill a god, even if the chances of this happening are low, they would avoid the risk as much as possible. To draw on further historical examples, the Vicarians instilled safeguards in the Noom to prevent us from harming them, unintentionally or otherwise, which seems a reasonable precaution and parallels the ban on further development of moral agents, beings with soul, and the removal from Svetokarstvo. Though there are differences in the species, the morality and a mind of the members of your own species, or similar species, are at least comprehensible to you. A truly alien mind, one that you cannot comprehend, can be scary. Such a mind may have such radically different ways of experiencing the universe and have priorities and values that are so foreign that they may not even notice or care about harm it causes you. Granted, the Kuliltu are expressly said to understand and function within the moral frameworks that the Gradil operate within, but the lingering cultural fear from Ethetos influence may have elicited extra caution. The way that certain Gradil are represented in the Sudran account indicates that there may have been a lingering negative sentiment towards them, at least some of them. As we've seen, Ishinima is a very important and positive figure to the Sudrans, and the other Gradil whose names are given hold enough importance to warrant note, even if it's not positive. Of note, the banishment from the realm of the gods is how we know that the Gradil were a spacefaring race. The Sudrans were not native to Kinimak, or as they called it, and there are no signs of past organic habitation on it, Kinimak, or the LHS 1140 local system. I won't get too far into the details, although they are fascinating, but this explains some of the oddities in the story. In particular, the reference to Ishinima giving up her divinity might be the deleterious effects experienced by a species that is unable to modify their physiology on any level, traveling to another world. Particularly Kinimak, which lacks a life-supporting atmosphere, a geomagnetic field, and any form of heat retention during its day-night cycle. This fits with my hypothesis regarding the Graditals' reliance on technology.
Ishinima petitioned the other Gradital to allow Sudra's body to be given to the Kuliltu of Ur, so that he might be laid to rest among his own people. The Graditel scorned her for giving Sudra his Dusa, but agreed to this request if she gave up her Shaman while in Ur. She agreed and left Svetokarstvo. When she came to Ur, she presented the Kuliltu with Sudra and explained how to give them his final rites.
Leave the deceased on display for 9 days, so there is ample time for those closest to them to pay their respects and for all to be present at the end of this period. Once 9 days have passed, the deceased's mind will be divided into enough fractions that all may imbibe some. Those closest to the deceased shall take the largest share, with the size decreasing with each level of familiarity. All shall verify that each has partaken, and that there is neither any mind left nor any who has not shared in that mind. Once confirmed, all shall offer any final words to the deceased, mourners, or whatever entities, mundane or divine, that they wish. Finally, the deceased's core shall be removed and laid to rest, and the remainder of their body repurposed or recycled in whatever manner best benefits all and honors the wishes of the deceased.
Ishinima sat with Sudra for 8 days, sharing stories of his life, fond memories she held of him, and telling tales of his character to all who gathered. As the Kuliltu gathered on the dawn of the 9th day, they found Ishinima had vanished. She had returned to Svetokarstvo, but placed 2 golden discs in the chair beside Sudra, where she held her vigil. Once all Kuliltu had gathered, each partook an equal share of Sudra's mind, as all know him only through Ishinima's stories. Ishinima is a clever Graditel, and within Sudra's body she hid a sliver of her Shema from the other Graditel, and that Shema was passed equally into each Kuliltu present, endowing them with Dusa and granting them the ability to think as the Graditel think.
Ishinima again goes against the will of the Gradidal for the benefit of the Sudrans, this time intentionally deceiving. She even puts herself at risk by giving up her divinity. This is a good example of the conflict between law and morals that I mentioned earlier. The instructions for the final rites are veiled lessons of the three things that she taught to Sudra: the sharing of stories of the deceased's life, dividing the mind into fractions weighted by the closeness to the deceased, and the need for all Sudrans to gather by the end of the 9 days, all serve to establish both individual identity and communal identity. Of course, the very nature of funeral rites establish the finality of death. The final words offered to entities mundane or divine may be seen as Ishinima encouraging continued worship of the Gradidal, but I believe that she is planting the idea that the Sudrans are free to embrace religion as they wish. Until further sites are discovered, we don't know if religion or religions were present or common among the Sudrans, but certainly they were there when these tablets were. It's not hard to infer what is meant by the sharing of the deceased's mind, since the Sudrans seem to be an artificial race, supported by the mention and presence of data cores at the site of the tablets. The mind is almost certainly the accumulated memories and experiential information from the life of the deceased.
Ishinima's words were given no meaning. She had hidden the secrets to Kuliltu reproduction in the instructions for their final rites. She knew that the Kuliltu would do as instructed, and, out of the Creator's love for her lost creation, she had instructed them to be as Sudra was and carry on his legacy, making them the first Sudran. Her final gift, the 2 golden discs, remains enshrined with Sudra's core, the golden eyes of the Creator watching over her beloved creation for all time.
The final tablet essentially serves as a conclusion to the narrative. It is the confirmation of Ishinima's goodwill towards the Sudrans and continued love for them, another strong indicator of a cultural identity and a shared origin by the Sudrans. The presence of a religion in a population is not necessary for establishing moral relevance in that population, but it can be sufficient. Religion often functions as a sort of prototype for moral philosophies. What is right and what is wrong, when dictated to you by higher authorities, remove much of the guesswork from moral decision-making. However, it is only when you begin to analyze these divine mandates that you may begin to expand morality into new and more interesting ground, offering new solutions to new problems that may not have existed at the time the religion established its moral rules. In either case, the deification of the Gradidal likely served to justify why the morals instilled by them should be still followed, even though they may no longer have applied without the presence of an organic race. In summation, the Sudran tablets serve as both the creation myth for an ancient race of artificial, inorganic life forms, and give us an entirely unique perspective on the development of morality over the course of the evolution of a species. From the humble beginnings as tools to fully realized species, the Sudran story is both singular in the known universe and reaffirming in its shared aspects with the cultures of other races. Of course, the mystery of the fate of the Sudrans lingers, but the legacy they left for us is a priceless gift to galactic civilization as a whole. Thank you all for joining me. I hope that this has been as interesting for you as it has been exciting for me. The citations for my analysis are visible now on the screen, and more detailed accounts of the artifacts at the site, as well as a deeper analysis by myself and Dr. Shiragami, are available at the Digispace for the University of Balhaven, as well as the kiosks here at the symposium.